welcome to today's webinar, How to Create Star Performers in Your Company, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Mark Hordes. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. Before we begin, note you can submit any questions you have using the window chat area on your control panel. We will answer questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as a follow-up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Mark Hordes is a senior partner at Allen Austin. He brings over 25 years of experience in consulting with organizations in human capital performance improvement, leadership development, creating high-performance organizations and teams, as well as culture and change management. Mark is the co-author of the best-selling business book, S-Business, Reinventing the Services Organization. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, Mark.
Thank you, Sarah. This is Mark Hordes, and I am very appreciative of everyone sharing a little bit of their busy lives with us this afternoon. I'm hopeful that you'll find your investment in time today a good investment in learning some new things, reinforcing some ideas you may already have, and particularly being able to put in practice some immediate tactical things that will help you really on two fronts. One, how to create star performers in your company, and two, things you can do to become a star performer. I think they're both sides of the same coin. The roadmap for today, as you can see on the slide, the agenda, is around 20 topics. Some I'll spend a little bit more time on than others. Others I'll just briefly mention. But you can see the roadmap. We'll take it from a pretty straightforward definition of what a star performer is, and we'll end with, okay, what can I do tomorrow in terms of a management to-do list, as well as some pretty interesting interactive things as we go along. So again, thank you for joining us today. Again, I hope your time today you'll feel is well spent. And of course, if there's any questions, make sure you use the sidebar to type them in. And if we don't get a chance to answer them directly at the end of the session, I will for sure answer them either on a phone call or an email if I get the contact information. So let's look at the goal today. I would see this as what our target is, what my specific target is, and that's to share with you ideas and approaches that you can utilize to identify and create more star performers in your company. Let me say on the upfront part of this that I have studied star performers in companies for the last 5 years in both clients that I've worked with, companies that I've visited, and feedback from colleagues and friends who work in different companies. And it's always a great party starter to say, well, what do really star performers look like in your company? What are their characteristics? How does someone become a star performer? And how do they survive the wave of cutbacks or changes that occur in a company? So what you're going to see this afternoon is a little bit of my research, however unscientific as it might be, on the things that I've heard over the last 5 years. This in ways has become a little bit of my hobby to try to get my arms around really star performers. Those are the ones that survive any kind of wave of change that you particularly see in a company, and they kind of bubble up and rise to the top. So that's where we're headed. I would think the ideas I'm going to present this afternoon are applicable to any company, any size organization. If you're a shoe hospital like I have in Houston here, or if you're a hotel receptionist, or if you're a banker or a teller or Indian chief, I think you will find ideas here that are applicable to any level in your company, any size organization, any place geographically where it might work. My feedback from my colleagues and others have been global in scope, not specific to any particular culture. So hopefully you'll find some ideas here that you think have application to you directly. So let's start first and foremost with what and who are star performers. Well, in a second I think you'll see the slide. It's a definition. There's a lot of definitions out there. Some might call them high potentials, talent, exceptional people. But this is a definition that I have pulled together from looking at multiple ways that the people I know have described it in different companies. So it's, first of all, a star performer is any individual, or it could be a star performing team. I don't want to just say this is individual-centric. They are capable of delivering outstanding business results and outcomes. Obviously, there's got to be a way to measure that that doesn't operate in a vacuum. But they take responsibility for achieving positive outcomes despite barriers that might be thrown in front of them, such as customer challenges, cultural issues, organizational and political dynamics. And as a senior executive at a bank once said to me in a personal conversation, you know, Mark, if I had one great performer, in my mind, that's equal if I had 3 average performers. So you have a 1-to-3 relationship here. And I think if everyone in a company was an A player, everybody would stand up and take notice. But it's pretty interesting. If I had 1 star performer, in my mind, that's equal to 3 average performers. Let me say at the outset that nothing wrong with being an average performer, but I believe strongly that everyone has the potential to be a star performer. Just depends on how you define it and how hard you want to work at fulfilling the vision you have for yourself. So let's take a look at how you can really achieve this on the next slide. And here you have a picture. I wouldn't say this is how I woke up this morning, but many a day I woke up saying, you ever felt like this? You know, where do you begin? So many different things to work on, so many priorities, so many different things coming at you. Sometimes it's hard to figure out the best step forward. And if someone could show me a roadmap or punch card or checklist, it might help. But many a day I'm sitting there with my head down saying, wow, how do I tackle all this? What can I do that provides some light at the end of the tunnel that's not another train coming at me, that I can make some headway here and advance the game, so to speak. So on the next slide, you'll see something called an archetype. And in my former life and training, I was trained as an organizational psychologist. And in the early days, we used a lot of psychometric testing, a lot of the within the mindset of individuals, an immediate reaction without a lot of thinking that often tells a lot about personalities. And those are typically called archetypes. Well, what's an archetype? An archetype is something that's typical of you. That's an easier way to say it. It could be your patterns, your talents, the things that are constant in your nature. So sometimes that hover below the surface. In essence, they're like the essence of you, the things that you are gravitated toward. You may not know why, but they're often representative of you. And they're, in many ways, observations of interpersonal self. They're influences on you and often others and the attitudes and behaviors that you exhibit. I know this all the time with my wife. I might be exhibiting some thought, attitude, or behavior that has a direct influence on her and ultimately comes back and have a direct influence on me. So I find these are pretty interesting, and I think it will be helpful for you to think about characteristics of star performers in terms of what are the typical attributes and archetypes that star performers have typically exhibited. So what you'll see on the next slide is a picture. In fact, there are 4 pictures, and I'll wait for them to come up so you can see them. And you can see 4 types of images, and I don't want you to put a lot of thinking space into this. This is more immediate reaction. I won't say it's like a Rorschach test, but it's immediate reaction. And that is, which one of these symbols or pictures do you most identify with? And we have number 1, we've got an image there of an athlete. Number 2, of a coach and a mentor. Number 3, a visionary. And number 4, a technical data kind of IT person. So, and you probably say, well, gee, I'm all 4 of those. Well, okay, this is kind of a forced choice test. You can only pick one of them, and you'll see they're numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in the sidebar in your question thing, if you would just immediately hit one of those numbers, you think and you believe that this symbol is most predictive of you. Picture that you can most identify. Either 1, athlete, 2, coach, 3, visionary, 4, technical data. So in the sidebar, if you would click one of those numbers, I'll give you about 10 seconds to pick one. And obviously there's some meaning behind these, which hopefully you'll find interesting at best and maybe even useful, which would be helpful. Okay, I see people are clicking in numbers. That's very good. Thank you for that. People are putting in all different kinds of numbers. Somebody put in that number 4 times, so I guess there must be a super athlete. Okay. All right, good. So I see we have a fairly interesting group of people who say, hey, I'm an athlete, and I also see we got a lot of people who see themselves as kind of a technical archetype, if you will. There's a good percentage who say, hey, I'm a visionary, and quite a few who say they're a coach. Well, that may be the nature of the business and how that's operating today, but that's an interesting distribution. So athlete, coach, visionary, technical data, architect. All right, now, what does all that mean? Like, who cares? All right, well, the next slide we'll get into a little bit about who cares and what does that mean. So, you know, in the many types of interviews I've had over the years with organizations, when I try to really get my arms around what do really star performers do? What are the characteristics that they exhibit that perhaps can be replicated in other parts of the company? Well, here's the definition around some of these, and these are not right or wrongs. I will say that the predominance of people who emerge as star performers fall a lot into the category of athletes and coaches here. And that's not to say that the other two are not important. But if you look at some of the subcategories of an athlete, this is someone who sees value in competition. They have a sense of their own personal power and the power of others. They have a high level of endurance. There's, you know, very little that's going to knock them off their horse. They can weather a lot of storms. They know how to pace themselves so they don't get burned out. They play fair. They're really good at encouraging others, but they like to win, and they don't give up. So, you know, things and conflicts that come their way, it keeps them on course. They get back on course. They see it as a learning opportunity, not something that makes them feel hopeless. The other side of that, the characteristics that made a lot of sense, are the ones identified in the coaching, and that they have compassion for others, and that they're not selfish. They have a very good insight into others, and particularly what I like about those characteristics, they have a sense of what others need. That's really a great attribute and skill. They can see what others need, and they can put themselves in the other person's shoes to be empathetic not only with the situation, but to get a little bit ahead of the game. Now, obviously, if we think about a star performer, perhaps the thing that most comes to mind is that these are visionary people. You know, the guy who invented the iPhone and Apple, and these guys can see 15 years into the future and see the next star that's going to happen. But there's some really interesting characteristics, too, that are part of that type of model. One, they always ask the question, what if? They see themselves as agents of change. They're unconventional. They can think out of the box. And they look to the future, not the past, and are always focused on what are the new possibilities, not what can't be done, but what can be done. The most difficult box, I think, which is hard to get out of, and I work with a lot of engineers and a lot of energy people in very technical industries, it's sometimes very hard for them to come out of the green box, and you can see the characteristics here. A star performer will utilize some of these, but they'll often have a team of others that will help with many of the things that you see in that particular green box. We know that details are important, but they will also have others spend a lot of time identifying in a quest for the truth of really what the essence is. But what I have found personally is that star performers do not put all their eggs in one basket in the green box here. It is pretty evenly distributed amongst the three. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do the things in the green box, but you should perhaps pick up some characteristics from the other three. So depending on where you landed, I think the goal and the challenge for you is, which of these characteristics can I embrace myself? Which are the ones that I am doing? Which are the ones that I'm not doing? And what would it take to help me embrace them more? So that's your Psychology 101, give you some insight into yourself, which has direct impact on others that you might work with, as well as how you progress in an organization and what an organization can do to create more A players. So let's get personal for a second. Let's think about the next slide. And in your mind's eye for a second, and of course if you want to post some questions and answers here, think about how would your company benefit if you had 10 times more star performers in your company what would the benefits be? And just think about that for a second as we progress here. Because I think at the end of the day, someone may ask you, so why should we bother? What's the benefit of doing that if we had more star performers or not? So as you think about that, you'll see on the next slide a list of things, and many of you have identified these that you put into the box yourself. But let's think about perhaps how some of these materialize. Well, you see things such as the emergence of a high-performance organization in teams. It certainly would help in better recruiting, and it would shift the culture to say basically these are the attributes, these are the things that are most important to us in our organization as we move forward. As you'll see a little later in the presentation, it will also help you with targeting your training more, and it will definitely help in recruiting because people like to work for companies that they see as high performing and also that have a very strong brand reputation in terms of this is a great company to work for and it is a place where I personally would like to be. So you can see the list as we embrace the entire list here of the different characteristics. And you're going to see that it can help you particularly in targeting your training. When we get to the training slide, I will share with you that about $3 to $5 billion a year is spent on training, but it may not be allocated the best way to get the best bang for your dollar. And I believe that when you have more star performers, the behavior of the organization certainly shifts to get more revenue, more customers, more satisfied customers, increase personal satisfaction, and the opportunity to share best practices because star performers are always kind of looking at that. So if someone said, so what's the benefit? Why should we bother? This is not a bad laundry list to start, and many of these things can absolutely be quantified. So in my mind, there's an absolute benefit to having more star performers in your company, more A players to sustain the test of time for all the reasons listed here. So, okay, now that we understand the benefits, let's take a look at the next idea. And that is, how do you determine who your star performers are? Now, this may not be the most scientific thing you've ever heard. This is not Einstein theory, but you would just absolutely be amazed. If you want to know who your star performers are, gee, ask your employees. People immediately know who the star performers are. They didn't need a big analysis often or study. They know who the people who are topping out at the top of the list. They knew who were making the best contributions. So the most simplest way, from an identification point of view, is to simply ask your employees. Now, if nobody can think of any, then you're probably in more trouble or not. But that's not a bad qualitative way to get your arms around it. The more structured approach, which I'll share with you a little later in the presentation, is to conduct what's called a star performer analysis. And I will be sending out a white paper which has a capability assessment in it where you can do a star performer analysis. Or you can hire an outside company like the work I do in Allen Austin to identify the people who fill those kind of roles and how you can do that more prolifically. The other thing that companies do, that once they've identified some star performers, is that they take time in talking and observing star performers on the job. They might be riding with them on a sales call. They might be observing how they work with teams or customers or in the field. They begin to see some very succinct characteristics, some very clear behaviors that move the game forward, that got the customer involved, that helped close the sale, got them engaged, got them involved, asking questions, playing attentiveness, and also things like that. So observing is really important if you know who the star performers are. Also, companies, once they've done that, they can identify star performer behaviors and create little vignettes, videos, and I'll share some of those with you in terms of moments that matter a little later in the presentation, into short learning lessons. Isolating, capturing, putting in a capsule, sharing with others is all about knowledge management and knowledge sharing. Now, if all else fails, you can also benchmark star performers in other companies. People have joined your ranks from other organizations. They've worked with people who are star performers, and they can share with you specifically what those people did and how did they exhibit those behaviors in real time. And of course, you can do an all-employee capability survey, which I mentioned. I have an example of that in the white paper I'll be sending out. At least that way you'll get some trends in your own company of the capability of your employees in terms of basic, advanced, moderate capability and skills that they have and how you can move those forward. And then lastly, you can do a review of your training priorities and how you're making your investments, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the session, because I don't really think that companies are investing appropriately when you think about how they're allocating their dollars. When we talk about $5 billion being spent in 2014 for training alone, that's a huge amount of money. Well, for those who are really interested in market intelligence, okay, that's interesting, Mark. But so what does the survey say? What does the research say? And as you can see on the next slide, there's some recent research that was done with about 2,500 HR leaders around the world in 93 countries. And the theme here was, what are the top 10 trends impacting global human capital and people and work in 2014? Now, when I first made this slide, in the areas reflected here in red, I saw at least 7 of the 10 that had a direct link to either high potentials, star performers, or those with the most talent. But actually, as I look at the list again, I would also probably add leadership development, because you often will see star performers and high potentials in leadership roles. In fact, a paper that I'm coming out with shortly, I think targets that, and particularly here in the energy sector in Houston where I live, a big issue is how do you transition technical experts into leadership roles. People being promoted because of their technical expertise, but they often lack the leadership capability, training, and skills to take on large teams, a different mindset completely. So I probably would add to my list leadership development is an area where a star performer can excel as well, and where companies are targeting their efforts. The last one I would say, HR technology. In fact, I hope they don't go too far in that direction, because it becomes more and more impersonal when they do that. In fact, yesterday from a very well-known company was trying to communicate with me, and they refused to do any kind of personal telephone call. They wanted everything on Instagrams. Well, I had to tell them I'm in the relationship business, and I like talking on the phone, so I really wasn't interested in trying to help them, but it can get out of hand just for expediency purposes. So I think the personal contact here is pretty critical. But this is a topic that's on everybody's mind. Research points it out. When you talk to 2,500 HR leaders in 93 countries, clearly this is something that's bubbling up to the top. Well, on the next slide, here's a little humorous cartoon. I think it's pretty self-evident. This is, if you will, how not to establish a star performer program. Here you have a boss talking to a subordinate. Let's assume that's a high potential. And he says, I can't give you a raise because your salary midpoint, but at least your stock options are doing great. And of course, the person says, I don't have any stock options. I'm probably thinking of myself. And I think the net ought to be, it says I should coach you on your interpersonal skills. Perhaps it should say, I should coach myself on my interpersonal skills. Here again is an example of not looking at the person, not understanding the person in front of you, and being aware, as star performers often are, of the individual in front of me, their skills, their attributes, their behaviors, and what's important to them. So take that for what it's worth. Another way to illustrate a pathway to star performer is illustrated on the next slide. And I think this is a very interesting way to exhibit it. This is, if you will, a snapshot of an as-is and to-be. And in my mind, it's a great way to tell a story. This is an actual example from a client that I've worked with. And on the left-hand side, you have a chapter or a page that really describes today's environment. So in today's environment, you can see it's very highly situational. It's inconsistent in terms of management approaches. There's a lot of cultures. Turnover is very high. People don't meet performance targets, et cetera, et cetera. Now, your situation would obviously be different. But I think it's a pretty interesting exercise to think about not only that and to document what the current environment is, but also to think about the to-be of what we would like our future environment to be. That's always a great starting point. So I'm just playing with the centerpiece a little bit where I say leaders in HR are committed to becoming a high-performance organization, ever-increasing A players, within teams and across the entire company. And then some of the inherent characteristics or behavior changes that need to make that occur. So I think it's a great way to kind of illustrate on a pictorial and story kind of way in terms of where you are, where you want to be, and in many ways can be a rallying point for where you want to go and how people can embrace it. So as I mentioned earlier, and it's illustrated on the next slide, when we think about training investments, and now we're talking about $5 billion invested in training, this is pretty interesting. I found, again, in my looking at this category over 5 years, there's 4 areas companies are typically putting their money in terms of training. Well, one, they're doing a budget allocation for training, and they're either putting a percentage of the money to improve poor performers or to get average performers a little better, maybe even allowing star performers to participate, and then also in coaching activities, involvement in community practice groups such as network groups. They might be technical groups, they might be cross-functional groups where knowledge is shared across boundaries or in depth in a technical area. And lastly, this one's a pretty tactical type of investment, those who are heavily vested in Six Sigma, continuous improvement teams, etc. So as you look at this chart in your own mind's eye, and you may not have privy to the exact percentage, but it'd probably be an interesting thing to go back and find out, in your own company, where exactly are you making these investments as a percentage of whatever dollars you have that are allowable for training. Now, I talked to a client yesterday, and I asked them this question. They said, it's not a problem. I go, why not? They said, because we have no money allocated for training. Okay, in that case, you probably know the answer. But I'm sure in every company, they have money allocated for training, but what's the best way? What is research sharing that can give you some guidance in terms of where best to put some of your dollars? So these are some of my findings on the next slide. And these are some of the recommendations I would make. And again, this is not wildly scientific. This is based on about 4 years of looking at it. And actually, in 2014, I talked about 50 or 60 companies to get some sense of where they're putting their money. And I'd like to say as a recommendation that in just training dollars generally, you'll see 10% going into poor performers, 40% average performers, and 50% in stars. And the interesting part about this recommendation is that stars are often left out of training completely, but you get the biggest leverage if you can take them to the next level than trying to make a poor performer into a minimal average performer. In terms of coaching, here you see an increase in terms of money being spent, and often I find it more effective for poor performers to have more one-on-one coaching than just running them through the general mill of training. I hesitate to say I shouldn't say that. I should say in the beginning, I'm not talking initially about just basic compliance training such as safety and EEOC discrimination types of things that everybody gets regardless of your level in the company. Those things are mandatory across the board. These tend to be more discretionary training events, either coming about as a result of career development, succession planning, checklist on needs, where the company is headed, etc. So things like safety, everybody needs it, etc. So in terms of involvement in community practice groups, you'll see often the money invested in poor performers, to join those, often they don't have very much to say. They're more the recipient of it than they are the leaders or participant of it. This is a category that average performers excel in because this is often very tactical, very operational. And star performers often play a role here too, because they're bringing in some thought leadership, some new ideas to stir the pot a little bit and to lead some of these efforts. And lastly, on CI, Six Sigma teams, here again, even though we might have trained everybody up on Six Sigma, what I've often seen is that poor performers don't make that big a contribution. Average performers do, and particularly stars get it increased and help it a lot as well. So again, these are recommendations. I would say the challenge for you is to go back to your own company and to try to find a justification for how we're allocating our training dollars, what's the rationale, what's the payback, and what's the result we're trying to get. I heard a couple of weeks ago a healthcare company called me and they said, we've got to do 16 hours of CEU and training. And I said, on what? And they said, on anything, just to check the box. Well, that may not be the best way to do it, and certainly not the best utilization of dollars. but at least there's some guidance here for you to think about. So in the next slide, let's assume that we've got our arms around who are star performers, and we know, gosh, that person just quit. That person just got recruited out of our company. We've invested a lot of money in them, him or her. How do we retain star performers? Nobody will work for a company forever, but the longer we can keep them, the more sustainable the impact will be on the organization. So here again is a list of things that I have gotten from companies that I've talked to on how they keep a very high percentage of their high performers operating star performers. One, they allow them to make a contribution. They don't isolate them. They don't take them for granted. They don't assume these should just be left alone in isolation. They pay attention to what they say. They make time for them. They constantly challenge them with complex, interesting issues that will affect the business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they will pay well for their performance. They give accurate feedback, and that they're sure they have clear objectives. And the most interesting thing on this list is the thing on the bottom. And I had an executive who shared with me, and I said, well, how do you create and how do you keep your star performers? And he said, we constantly focus on creating moments that matter. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, let me share with you an example, which I will now share with you on the next slide. So what's a moment that matters? This is just a point in time where something happens where it either can be a positive or negative experience. So, okay, let's assume for a second I'm a star performer. I'm a high potential. I'm an A player, and I see my supervisor, boss, whoever, by the soda machine, and I stop by for a minute, and I ask them for some feedback and an idea they have, or I want to discuss something, or I want to raise an idea. And now the continuum can swing one way or the other. If it swings in the negative way, what you're going to see is non-supportive behavior, that they're not going to listen to me. I can tell by their body language they're going to ignore me, or they're not going to make the time to even engage in a conversation. If it swings in the positive side, we see a lot of active listening going on, eye contact, body language, looking toward me. They're making time for me. They're encouraging me. And the positive behaviors of that, they take a moment to stop and actively listen. They schedule time on their calendar to meet with me. Ahead of the meeting, they'll do some research. During the meeting, they'll share types of discussions that help the organization. And they'll proactively encourage me to continue to share, ask for feedback, et cetera. On the negative side, that don't work well, that tends to be demotivating, they try to distance themselves from me. Do you ever try to go move forward to talk to someone and you see them kind of running away? That's a pretty interesting piece of feedback. They state that they're too overloaded or too overworked to work with you. They tell me the best time to review the topic in a formal meeting, which has never been scheduled. Once they commit with me, they cancel the meeting 4 or 5 times, and they make any time to reschedule. So, okay, let's assume I'm a boss, I'm a leader of an organization. How can I encourage more moments that matter? Not only this has a direct impact on star performers, but I would say it has a direct impact on the entire organization. We should encourage positive behavior through leadership, understanding, communication, mentoring, and coaching. We make sure that staff have the behavior objectives that you're trying to achieve. What shifts in behavior do we trying to achieve as part of everyone's personal development plan? We should train managers and line staff in behavior-based leadership and commitment-based management, other than just situational leadership or things we learn out of a book or box, or et cetera. And most importantly, I think you can create a whole bunch of scenarios and role plays and simulations where everyone gets an opportunity to practice positive moments that matter. This is not only a thing that helps and foster culture in a company, but really will get the attention of star performers and help others who aspire to that type of positional role as well. So remember, moments that matter. Every company can create scenarios that help people in real-time situations like this. So moments that matter really do matter for star performers. Doesn't take too many of those to stack up on the negative side for them to decide, I think I'll start talking to that recruiter about that position because I think the culture is a little better and more receptive. So as you can see on the next slide, if I could distill down just 6 things that I've seen star performers exhibit, without getting overly complicated here, that are very, very repeatable in many of the companies that I've looked at and I've studied and I've worked with, it would be these 6. And they're not in any priority order. That's why I put them in a circle. But they do have a direct impact on creating star performer behavior. So you can think of yourself as well, how many of these things do I do personally, and how does the company foster these types of behaviors? First, they take the initiative. They are proactive. They are not reactive. They seize the opportunity to move forward. They take a chance. They take a risk to seize the opportunity, often in a leadership role. It could be as part of a volunteer group and things that they do, or a professional association, or an initiative inside a company. When everyone says, who would like to lead this, their hand goes up. They share best practices through show and tell, through lunch and learns, through short videos, through dropping in on team meetings, to talk about how things have worked for them and not worked for them as they've gone on the journey of work and dealing with customers and other teams and projects. They demonstrate organizational savvy. I mean, that's fancy to say. They understand the politics. They know when to talk up and shut up. They demonstrate team effectiveness. They talk in terms of we, not I. They talk in terms of we and us and not I. They understand the value of the team and working with and through others, not that one person carries the load and does all the heavy lifting. And they are extremely disciplined and self-managed on how they focus their time, how they focus their priorities, and what they work on until they're satisfied that that thing's been drained of all the ideas. So these are 6 things. They're not earth-shattering, but they are sometimes difficult to do unless you really say, okay, these are things or what my priorities should be, and how can I make that a reality inside my own company? Well, there is a roadmap, and I like to do these sessions, as you can see on the next slide, with a roadmap, if you will, or a blueprint of how you can move forward on some of these in a more methodological kind of way, that if given nothing else, you'll have a roadmap of how you can achieve some of this. So this is a 5-step process that I have seen work tremendously in companies. It does follow pretty much an operational type of perspective, but at least you know what is going to happen as you're putting one foot in front of the other. The first column represents an assessment of your talent and culture, and I think those are pretty self-evident. I'm not going to read the list to you, but the net here is really you get a pretty good understanding of the mix of the talent in your organization, and particularly the evaluation of the strengths and the opportunities and its impact on performance. The next step in the journey is a talent management needs identification in terms of a scorecard. There's got to be a way to measure this stuff, and your goal here is to come up with the right kind of measures that take a look at both behaviors and outcomes and how the organization can contribute to fulfilling some of those for now and in the future. The third column is more of what we call a psychometric profile of the leadership team. Sometimes organizations are only as effective as the teams that lead them, and this is a interesting profile that looks at an introspective view in terms of how you see culture, how you see others, how you see yourself, and how synergistic that might integrate it in with your other team members. And I think that kind of profile is helpful not only for internal growth, but also to get the right team in place to make sure that we're all pulling in the right direction. And the last part of the roadmap here is really a focus on strengthening your talent bench. And I think that's really the net here, because with this, you're really looking at what are the best practices we're bringing to bear, what's identification of what's required to build a star performer environment where everyone's an A player, everyone is a high potential, and how can we help those who are not to try to strive for that kind of vision, and then what kind of best practices and lessons learned can we apply here. And I find 2 things that companies don't do enough of, and they're always interested in. One is what are the best practices and what are the lessons learned. It's not that they're not interested in it, they just often don't have the time for it. So if you can certainly do some investigation on that front, you get an open ear and open 2 ears to hear about some best practices and how that's transferable to your own company. So, okay, so today is Wednesday, and if I said to the team in front of me, that be the leadership team or the bank team or the hotel team or even a place where I always find a star performer at the Houston Shoe Hospital, and I'll talk about that in a minute, where there's a great star performer working there who really just takes my order to put soles on my shoes, but he is a star performer. And if I was dealing with a management team and they'd ask the question on the next slide, what is my management to do that I can put my arms around starting tomorrow? Well, here's a short list. They're not necessarily in priority order, but it's not a bad way to progress and think about how might we achieve these. First of all, it's really important to calculate if we do have a gap in this area between average and star performers and poor performers. What is that gap? Is it minor, is it major, or is it moderate? So who do we have that's in those categories, how big that gap is? Because if we don't know how big that gap is, we certainly will lack an understanding how to close that gap. Then we should also take a look at how are we allocating our training dollars and who is it appropriate for who and what's the rationale behind that and what's the outcome. Do we have a coaching process and internal methodology in place where that's accessible for people? Mentoring, coaching, you'll see that's a best practice. How do we operationalize it? How do we manage it? How do we access it? It doesn't make a difference. We also should think about a fast-track approach to high potentials and top talent. And many companies are creating a dual-track process where they're throwing the procedure book to the left a little bit, and when they see a high potential, it's fast, straight ahead, full steam ahead, and not the traditional process that might take 4 months to bring somebody on board who's a star performer. By that time, they've probably got 7 other or 10 other offers to join someone else. I'm a big believer in paying incentives to employees who can identify and help bring into the company other top performers. Everyone will need a development plan, which is now falling out of favor, and I think that's a shame because everyone needs to know where they are and where they're headed. And also to review your talent program, it's critical to get some understanding of where you are relative to your best practices. And also, as I mentioned before, think about how many moments of matter can we create in our company to identify and move forward and give people that basic understanding. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about some key takeaways here. And let me just have you look at that list just for a second, and because I think this is a really good way just to summarize, hopefully, what you've heard and given you some insight. The first is there are some characteristics of star performers that can be replicated and become quite contagious if you follow some same process of assessment, understanding the gap, and also doing some observations to get your arms around those characteristics. Number 2, keep in mind that the leverage here, the more star performers you have, the leverage is incredible in the company in terms of customer satisfaction, revenue growth, market share, enablement of teams, how we collaborate, all that. So 1 star performer is probably even higher than 3 average performer. The research clearly indicates this is a high priority for many companies, at least in 93 countries has identified that. You can reallocate your training investments to get greater performer results, but I think you've got to step back and look at how you're allocating your dollars, what's the benefit to what groups, for what purpose, and what's the results. And as I mentioned, I think you can create a bunch of different scenarios to train people, to educate, to transfer knowledge on moments that matter. Experiential things like this make a huge difference in people's behavior. And lastly, there is a roadmap, there is a blueprint. It's a 5-step process that you can follow, which I have been exposed to over the last 10, 15 years that I know has some real strength and sustainability of time. So there you have it, make you more than dangerous, excuse me, on how to create star performers in your company, how you can become a star performer. The journey is ahead of you. You can take it 1 gulp at a time or 1 step at a time. But anyhow, I think it's achievable. It shouldn't be something that's not part of your vision. It's just a matter of how you can get there, how long it might take, how fast you can commit to it, and what you need to do to be successful. Excuse me. So now I'll turn it over to Sarah. I see a lot of people have posted questions. I thank you for your participation this afternoon, and we've got a bunch of different questions here that people have posted, and I'll try to address some of those, and others I'll try to answer on email or a phone call if you want to talk more privately. I'd be happy to do that as well. Sarah?
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. And we actually do have some time for you to send in your questions. So attendees, why don't you go ahead and send those in now. And while we wait for those questions to come in, let me share a few quick ways to keep in touch. You will see Mark's contact information on this slide. He can be reached through his email as well as his phone and his website at allanaustin.com. And you can always keep in touch with us at the regular social networking channels. And don't forget, you can always use that special offer you will be receiving in your email to shop at HRDQstore.com. So, and yes, we do have a number of questions coming in, so why don't we go ahead and get that started. And it looks like our first question is coming from Katie, and she wants to know, what has been your experience with personal profile behavior and personality assessment instruments to identify star performers? Good, bad idea, or it all depends?
I think it's really a good idea. I don't do real well on those, particularly on the math part of them. I'm more a people person, so the math part of them always kind of screws me up. You know, how long does it take to travel from point X to 3 if you're given 3 pounds of pennies on an oak flying ship from here to Rockland? I don't do real well with them, but the other parts of them, I found them pretty interesting. I think any kind of feedback on interpersonal behavior, introspective things, if you take the results at heart, if that is either 360 feedback or psychometric tests, particularly for leadership teams, are really beneficial. Now, just taking them and never getting any feedback or taking the results and beating you over the head with them, I think that's not beneficial. But I think sometimes you're never a prophet in your own house. You never see yourself as others see you. And I think these instruments have some content validity. Of course, someone who's been trained as an organizational psychologist, I've used these a lot. And I think they are revealing, and they can be helpful if you take the feedback to heart. Now, there's some people who look at these and say, well, that's just not me. This is a bunch of BS. I don't believe it, whatever. But I think you could identify some definite characteristics to help you move to the next level of how you interact, how you behave, and your own personality. I mean, I believe everything is changeable. Nobody's fixed in cement for the rest of their life, regardless of your age, status, company you worked in. There's always opportunity to grow and improve. So I'm a supporter of them. I don't think it's the only peg in the box, but I think they play a valuable role, particularly for a leadership team that really has to gel and work well together and not be an angst kind of group. Okay, Sarah, next question.
Okay, perfect. And our next question is coming from Mark, and he said, how do you deal with people who are not identified as a star performer but feel they should be recognized as a star performer?
Well, sometimes a little dose of reality is helpful here. I think it's very important to identify performance outcomes and metrics that people need to achieve. And I think in that situation, I may think that I'm Superman or Superwoman, but when I'm being held accountable for, either that's sales results or identifying breakthrough in teams or attending certain things or volunteer participation in the community, I think here a performance metric scorecard that is shared early on with people in terms of their needs, wants, and expectations on both sides of the coin is important. You know, sometimes people think they're fabulous, but the rest of the organization think they're just average. So I think the quantification here of the metrics on how people are evaluated and the things that you have agreed to that you will be evaluated on play a significant role. Now, someone can argue about, well, you know, I don't agree with this feedback. Well, okay, you can't convince everyone of a fact all the time, but I think that's a real reality test to say, okay, here were the metrics we identified. 3 out of these 5 you've met, 2 of them, 1 of them you've exceeded, and 5 or 6 others you didn't meet. So let's talk about how we could improve here. So I think that tends, I wouldn't say put people in their place, but I think it does level set a little bit, assuming that they have an opportunity to participate in those metrics early on, that they think they're reasonable, and there is some intermittent feedback on how they're doing along the way instead of just D-Day in which it gets crashed over my head. So I think intermittent feedback so people can improve on that scorecard and outcomes is just as important as having them.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And it looks like our next question is coming from Charles, and he wants to know, are there any tips or tricks to recognize star performers publicly or in a group setting without creating negative effects in your average performer pool?
I think there are, and I'm remembering once, a long time ago, I'll take the opposite approach here, where I was working with a Japanese company, and it was cast of thousands, the end-of-year review, and the chairman was in the front, and there was 2 chairs, one to the left and right of him, And to the left was the plant that had the highest revenue, highest output, was the best plant in the world. And the chair next to him was the plant that had the worst outcome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I didn't want to be in that right chair. That was just called public humiliation. But for them, that was a way to do it. I think it's okay to publicize through websites and what I call case studies and examples without blowing just an individual horn, but also talking about how things were done to accelerate and improve a situation. You know, clearly there's going to be some times that people help and try to drive the effort. I think as much as you can involve others in that description of it, the less it dilutes that that person's king and everybody else is a servant, so to speak. So having other people involved in that description of how they helped, nobody ever worked in isolation. Nobody was an island unto themselves. I think it will dilute that aspect, like that person's a king and everybody else is just a poor performer, average performer. And I think the opportunity is there to do that. And that can either be through all-hands meetings, it can be through intranet on-site things, it can be case studies that are sent out, it can be show and tells, lunch and learns, and things like that. I know I do a lot of presentations, a lot of conferences. I would say 95% of them I always do with a client. I always take the client to take the lead because I think it's just as much their story as it is mine, without me saying, I made that happen, I did this, versus collectively we made a difference, and let Mike talk about what's meant for them and how they played a role, a significant one, in making it work successfully. I think sharing the sunlight a little bit makes everybody healthy.
Okay, great, thank you. And looks like our next question is coming from Norm, and he wants to know, why do star performers leave their current employers? Is there any way to set up a fail-safe system to ensure that will not occur?
Well, this may not be surprising. I mean, I think the number one reason people leave their company is the culture of the company. There's just not the right chemistry there, or they run into so many roadblocks that are culture counterintuitive, if you will. They're just not comfortable to being able to be all that they could be with others in that environment. And it's often not pay, it's not location, it's not even the industry. It all comes down to kind of how we operate, the culture of the company, how we communicate, how we collaborate, how we do things together, how fill in the blanks. It's pretty much culture. And I think if you constantly focus on our culture, what we want our culture to be, are we living the culture? I will never forget my years working with American Express, the blue box values they had, and every time we had a meeting together, before a decision was made, they had, this is the question they said, let's stop for a minute and see how that decision aligns with our blue box values that were in every single room of the company. And that not only reinforced the value of the company, but the culture of that company every single time. And things that were so contrary to that culture, they didn't do or they re-examined. So I think our focus on our culture, our vision, our values cannot be said enough. And that's the reason why people stay, and that's the reason why people leave.
Okay, great. And it looks like we have time for just a few more questions. So how about we'll take this from Paul, and he wants to know, how do you fast track a potential to become a star performer? Is there a proven way to do this?
Well, there's no such thing as instant pudding and no 100% guarantee, as they say, except life, death, and taxes, so to speak. But I think there is a way to fast track some people that you identify as high potentials, and that is to give them a particular challenge that has been quite bothersome for a company or very complex for a company that would not only, if solved, bring about just incremental change, but major impactful change in whatever that happens to be. It could either be in the customer base, our relationships, our profitability, cost leadership, which is an interesting term, anything that makes a significant impact to ask a star performer or high potential or an A player to take the lead on that and involve others. And I find if that is accomplished, of course that can be a seesaw, it can go up or down, but if it's accomplished, it does help that person rise to the top with the team that they're working with to make it happen. So I think identifying the things that are the biggest barriers for us that we may have tried for years to make breakthrough on that we're unable to do, that's a fast track process. And I think identifying the star performers, letting them know that they're important to the company, that they're valued, and rewarding them accordingly. I'm not saying that money buys everything, but it can help a star performer feel that they were appreciated, particularly the one-on-one conversations, not just the mass emails that get sent out to everybody that says, Joe's a star performer, everybody be like him. But some of those one-on-one conversations mean a lot to people, and that's how I've seen companies begin to break through the barriers that are presented that elevate and accelerate star performers into higher heights within a company.
Okay, wonderful. And I think we have time for just one more question. And this one is coming from Peter. If you had to pick the top 4 or 5 critical organizational behaviors that star performers exhibit that really make the biggest impact and difference, what would they be?
Okay, that's a great question, and thanks for asking. Let me conclude with a tip which I have found extremely useful to others I've shared with, and this is a feedback I've been given. Sometime in your life and in your employment, you may be in the elevator with a C-level person or your boss or somebody else that matters to you, and a very innocuous question that's often asked, so what have you been doing, right, or what's new? And I call this the rule of 3. You should always be thinking about the 3 biggest accomplishments that you are making to the company, so when you are ever asked that in any circumstance, in any environment, in any elevator, in every social gathering, you will always have those 3 things on the top of your mind. Now, why not list 10? Why not list 20? Somehow, market research has shown people's attention span dissipates after 3 on everything. So I call that my rule of 3. This is something you can do tomorrow. Write down the 3 accomplishments that you think have made the biggest difference. Maybe it's I showed up for work, I stayed at work, and I left on time at the end of the day, to be facetious. But everyone has accomplished something in a company. Remember your rule of 3. And you'd be surprised that perks people's attention up. Where, okay, can you meet with me and tell me more about that? Well, that's interesting. Who did you do that with? I wasn't aware of that. Let's have lunch together. Gee, could you stop by? Would you mind sharing that with some others? A lot of extensions, a lot of things happen as a result of that. So remember your rule of 3. I think that makes the biggest difference. I'm not saying that there aren't other things I've mentioned in this presentation that behaviors that star performers do. I think you've seen a plethora of ideas and characteristics. But star performers are always keen to know the 3 biggest things they've done, 3 biggest behaviors that they've exhibited that made a difference to the company. And they're not shy about sharing them either. And again, we is much more important than I. Thank you, Sarah.
All right, great. Well, Mark, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And would you just like to add any final thoughts?
Other than if you'd like to have some further information, I do workshops on star performers. I work with companies. And if you'd like a copy of that capability assessment, I'll be sending that out as well. And anything at all that you think would be beneficial for you, you have my email address, you have my phone number. I love talking on the phone and helping people to be better and to help people in their own progression to be a star performer, so please be in touch with me. And again, thank you so much for sharing a valuable part of your day. I certainly appreciate it. I'm sure HRDQ appreciates as well. They have fabulous products. I've used it for years. Take advantage of their product category, and please be in contact with me. And thank you for joining us this afternoon.
All right, great. Well, Mark, again, thank you so much. And if we did not get time to answer your questions, you will receive probably an emailed response in about a week or so. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.